Have you ever wondered why some emotional pains seem so intense and hard to overcome? Suffering is a part of life, but do we always have to carry it the same way? Today, we will explore how your brain processes suffering and how you can learn to deal with it differently, using tools based on neuroscience. Neuroscience has shown that our relationship with suffering doesn't have to be static. Understanding our brain's reactions and how we can regulate them is the first step toward transforming the way we handle challenges. Imagine having the power to choose more conscious and constructive responses instead of being carried away by pain. If you are tired of suffering without knowing why or want to develop a healthier relationship with your emotions, stay with me until the end. In this video, we will demystify the brain processes behind suffering and share practical strategies that can help you change your life. Suffering is part of life, but how many times have we asked ourselves if that suffering is truly inevitable? For many, emotional suffering seems to arise automatically, almost like an uncontrolled reflex. What if, instead of passively accepting it, we could understand why it happens? And more importantly, what if it were possible to alter our reaction to it? Today, we will delve into an innovative approach to deconstructing suffering based on neuroscience, turning it into something we can understand and, to some extent, control. In this video, you will discover how the brain processes suffering and why it can seem so intense. We will explore the roots of this process and, most importantly, offer practical strategies for you to learn to cope with it better. Understanding the brain is the first step toward transforming how we live with our pains. Why is it so essential to understand suffering? Throughout life, we face challenges, losses, and frustrations that affect our well-being. Often, we feel powerless, as if we have no choice but to endure these emotional pains. But science has shown that understanding suffering can radically change our experience and how we cope with these situations. By understanding what happens in the brain during these moments, we gain tools to act more consciously. Instead of simply putting up with suffering, we start to see possibilities for reducing its impact. When we know how and why the brain reacts to emotional pain, we feel more empowered and less at the mercy of those intense emotions. Moreover, knowing the mechanisms of suffering helps us develop a more active and positive stance toward difficulties. Understanding generates a sense of control, which is essential for personal growth and resilience. Throughout this video, you will see that suffering does not have to be an inevitable sentence. It can be deconstructed and transformed into a process that strengthens us. To deconstruct suffering, it is essential to understand how it is interpreted by the brain. When we go through a painful experience, specific areas of our brain come into play, responding similarly to what happens during physical pain. For instance, the amygdala, a deep structure in the brain, is responsible for detecting threats and generating an alert response. In situations of emotional suffering, it enters an alert state that amplifies emotions, causing discomfort to become even more intense. Another crucial component is the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain involved in rational thinking and decision-making. In situations of emotional pain, this area tries to interpret the situation and find a solution. However, when the suffering is too strong, the amygdala tends to take over, making rational control difficult. This response is automatic and part of our survival instinct, which explains why emotional suffering is often felt so overwhelmingly. There's also an interesting relationship between emotional and physical suffering. Research shows that areas like the anterior cingulate cortex activate in both types of pain. This means the brain does not differentiate much between physical and emotional pain, both are processed in overlapping regions. This overlap helps us understand why disappointment or loss can literally hurt. However, these automatic responses are not definitive. Studies suggest that we can regulate these reactions and calm the amygdala by redirecting the role of the prefrontal cortex to help us react more balanced. Science shows us that, with practice and awareness, we have the capacity to reprogram the brain to reduce the intensity of suffering and regain emotional control. In the next chapters, we will explore some of these neuroscience-based techniques. One of the biggest challenges in dealing with suffering is accepting that not all of our brain's reactions are under our immediate control. However, scientific knowledge reveals that, although emotional suffering is an automatic response, the way we react to it can be, in part, controlled and even transformed. To better understand this, we need to distinguish between what we can and cannot control. When something painful happens, our first reaction is usually automatic and intense because the brain, especially the amygdala, is programmed to quickly identify and respond to threats. This explains why some emotional pains seem to escape our control initially. These impulses are natural and serve to protect us from immediate risks. However, it is possible to work on moderating these reactions over time. What is within our reach, then, is what we do right after that initial response. By learning to pause and observe our emotional response, we can calm the brain and prevent it from amplifying the suffering. Additionally, our interpretation of an event can also be modified. The prefrontal cortex, where we process rational thought, is essential at this point because it allows us to think more balanced and reevaluate the situation, reducing the intensity of suffering. This type of control requires practice and attention, but neuroscience proves that, over time, we can strengthen our ability to cope with emotional pain more consciously. Knowing what is beyond our control, the initial automatic response, and focusing on what we can control, our interpretation and reaction, gives us a sense of power and freedom. In the next chapters, we will explore proven techniques to develop this skill and, thus, transform how we face suffering. Now that we understand what the brain does in moments of suffering, it is time to discuss the strategies that neuroscience recommends for dealing with these situations. These are practices that, over time, can help reduce the intensity of emotional suffering and increase control over our reactions. Controlled breathing. One of the quickest ways to calm the brain is through breathing. When faced with a difficult situation, our breathing tends to become short and rapid, which further activates the amygdala's alert system. Practicing controlled breathing, deeply inhaling through the nose, holding the air for a few seconds, and exhaling slowly through the mouth helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes a state of calm. This simple act of focusing on breathing slows the heart rate and sends a message to the brain that the threat is not so imminent, reducing the intensity of the emotional response. Cognitive restructuring. Cognitive restructuring is a practice that involves changing how we interpret a situation. Our perceptions often influence the intensity of suffering. The same event can be seen as a problem with no solution or as a challenge to be overcome. To apply this technique, start questioning your automatic thoughts. Am I interpreting this in the most balanced way, or what other perspectives are there on this situation? By challenging these thoughts, our brain activates the prefrontal cortex, helping to reduce the initial emotional response and allowing for a more rational analysis. Over time, this practice helps us respond to suffering in a more controlled and less impulsive manner. Mindfulness and meditation. Mindfulness has gained prominence as one of the most effective practices for reducing stress and improving emotional regulation. This practice involves focusing on the present moment, observing thoughts and sensations without judging them. When we apply mindfulness in moments of suffering, we learn to observe our emotions without trying to suppress or amplify them. The practice of meditation, in particular, helps strengthen the brain's capacity to deal with challenging thoughts and emotions. Studies show that regular mindfulness practice alters the activity of the amygdala, decreasing its reactivity and increasing emotional control. This technique is powerful because, in addition to calming the mind, it teaches us to accept what we are feeling, making suffering more manageable. Social connections and support. Research shows that positive social interactions play an essential role in our ability to cope with suffering. Talking with someone we trust about what we are going through releases oxytocin, a hormone that helps reduce stress and promotes well-being. Additionally, social support helps us see situations more objectively, which can lighten the emotional burden. It's no wonder that the brain responds positively to social connections. They make us feel less isolated, helping to reduce emotional pain. Seeking support is not a sign of weakness but rather a way to activate one of the brain's natural tools to face suffering more healthily. Self-compassion practice. Finally, self-compassion is a technique that teaches us to treat ourselves with kindness and understanding in difficult moments. Instead of criticizing ourselves for what we feel, self-compassion proposes a welcoming approach. This practice helps reduce self-imposed pressure, which often intensifies suffering. When we allow ourselves to feel and embrace our own emotions, the brain tends to respond less intensely to suffering. Studies indicate that self-compassion activates brain regions associated with comfort and well-being, such as the reward system. Practicing self-compassion is a reminder that we are human and that moments of pain are part of the experience. In summary, by implementing these practical strategies, we can reprogram our brains to respond differently to suffering. The tools based on neuroscience offer pathways to a more balanced and constructive approach to emotional pain. In conclusion, suffering is a part of life that we often feel we have to accept passively. However, with the insights offered by neuroscience, we see that we can actively engage with our suffering and, with practice, learn to deconstruct it. Understanding how the brain processes emotional pain gives us the tools to respond more effectively, reducing its intensity and allowing us to regain control over our emotions. Remember that you are not alone in this journey. Everyone faces moments of suffering. By applying the strategies we discussed, such as controlled breathing, cognitive restructuring, mindfulness, social support, and self-compassion, you can change the way you interact with your emotional pains. So, the next time you find yourself in the midst of suffering, remember that it doesn't have to be a solitary path. With knowledge and practice, you can transform it into an opportunity for growth and healing. Thank you for watching, and I hope these insights help you on your journey toward a healthier relationship with suffering.